All right, so let me start with just some housekeeping. First, I want to call out my sponsor, the IIBA of Tampa Bay, and thank them for giving me a platform to present this information. And welcome back. If you've been at the first couple of sessions, welcome back. If you're brand new and this is your first session, then welcome to your first session. You will get at the end, I'll send out to anybody that sends me an email requesting it. I will send you a copy of the slide deck as a PDF, and eventually I'll get the recording to you. I apologize, I would have had last week's done, but I had to help my mother, who's 80 plus years old, move this week. So I've been really busy with that, but I will have last week's and this week's out to everybody who attended in the next few days. So with that, let me go ahead and start. For those of you that have not been on one of these sessions, my name is Richard Frederick, and I teach a course, actually two courses, specific to business data analytics, the language of data. One is a requirements development class, and the other is a project management class. They are traditional courses. It's a traditional requirements class following elicit, analyze, document, and validate. And it's a traditional project management class with the 5 fingers of project management: initiate, plan, execute, control, and close, or envision, plan, develop, validate, and deploy, depending on your methodology. The only difference is that I focus predominantly on data. And the reason I focus on data is because the traditional courses, and again, this is not a knock against any traditional class, predominantly focus on product and process. And I felt like data was really important, mainly because I have a background in it, and because I think it is a big component of where we're going as business analysts, product owners, scrum masters, project managers, whatever group you fall into. All right. So with that, here's just the highlighted yellow. What these webinars really are about is I'm presenting what I call the foundation concepts of the class that I teach. I figure if you like the concepts and you like these webinars, maybe you will like the whole class. So that's my sales pitch right there. A little bit about me. In the 1990s, I started a software company doing workflow automation called Assured Solutions. We're still in business. We just don't do workflow automation anymore. We specialized on the Macintosh and corporate graphics in Dallas, Texas. The company's headquartered in Dallas, Texas, even though I have relocated to Florida. My partner, he still lives in Dallas. This particular section is called Requirements and Testing, the 4 quadrants. And before I get into it, I'm just going to tell everybody, the goal here isn't to turn you into a tester. So don't think at all that that's my mission. I focus on testing in my courses because at the end of the day, a requirement has to be tested in order to be validated. And it doesn't always come to us as analysts in a testable format. So we have to work with other stakeholders to convert it from what I call nuanced ambiguity, which is natural language, into something structured that can be tested. Structured English, structured query language, something of that nature. On the first slide that I showed you, and let me just hop up there really quickly because I just realized this. The thing about converting nuanced ambiguity or natural language into structure is that nobody really knows exactly how to do it. That's what all these symbols are for. That's the purpose. There's all of these standards. Everything I teach is open source. My goal is for you to train the trainer, take what you learn in here and go present it to someone else. Hopefully you'll save them some time and energy, but recognize that everything I'm presenting to you, none of it I invented. So these are all the different standards that I pulled my information from. What I learned in working with analysts and training analysts is that there's a set curriculum that teaches us how to elicit requirements predominantly for product and process-oriented projects. No problem there. The structure of how you do it doesn't change, but there's some nuance or some subtle differences when you're pursuing data. This particular section doesn't really delve into data as much. We did that last week. But in this structure, in this section, in this webinar, what I'm really trying to get you to do is, like each one of these webinars that I do, to think like a tester, just to think like a tester. I'm not trying to make you a tester, but I want you to think like a tester, because the more you think like a tester, the more successful I think you will be in eliciting or gathering requirements from your stakeholders. Okay, so each week I try to make that case a little bit more. So first of all, what is a requirement? Well, here's the funny thing about that statement. There's a lot of different groups that have a definition, and they are all correct. So I'm not one to tell anybody that their definition of a requirement is wrong, because there's different definitions and they're all correct. The other thing that I always try to point out to people is I don't necessarily think that there's a wrong way to write a requirement. What I believe is either the requirement that you write, it either works because it's testable or it doesn't work. So, and that's really what it boils down to. And if it doesn't work, it fails. And if it fails, you got to go all the way back to the beginning and start over, which is called rework. And rework, by definition, is the killer of productivity. The flip side is reuse. Reuse creates productivity or maximizes productivity. Rework kills productivity. So the idea and the question that I always get is, how do you write a requirement right the first time around? And the answer is, I don't really know. But what's important to know is, how do you build something that's testable? So my approach is to simply say a requirement is a testable statement. So what is a testable statement? It's a test case. And a test case is basically two parts. There's a main clause and a subordinate clause. The main clause we call the front side, and the subordinate clause we call the back side. What they don't tell us, wherever we're trained or wherever we work, they don't always tell you everything you need to know, because they assume that you already know these things. So I'm trying to fill in some of those gaps. What no one really explicitly says is that the requirement statements, the vast majority of requirement statements that you get from your stakeholders, the system shall or as a, I need, so that, the user story, or the traditional system shall statement, that those are actually the subordinate clause or the back end of a test case. So when your stakeholders ask for things, we need this or we need that, what they're giving you is the backside, what you're going to test. What they don't give you is the front side, which is what drives or sets up the test. And so a big part of our job is to go figure that out. So on this slide, I've got things color coded because it makes it easier for me. So the green, that's the requirements that we usually get from our stakeholders, just that one side of the statement. The red and the blue, that's what we have to go out and work with our other stakeholders, our team, to figure out how to drive the green results that the stakeholders are asking for. Okay, so here's an example. And this comes from a class that I've taught many times, and I think it's fascinating because there's two parts to it. Usually we only get the first part, where it says request or capability. It says we need our customers to know that we care about them. And I don't know about you, but I've been in plenty of meetings where that's all the information I was given. They go, okay, go build us something. Here's what we need. We gave you our need. You told us you wanted the need. That's the need. Okay. Unfortunately, that alone doesn't really do much for you. And that piece of it, I call the request. So when your stakeholders sit you down and they give you a request, the request is also known as the capability. And so that was one of the things that I always look at is, the capability. What is the capability? We need our customers to know we care about them. To really make that something that can begin to be measured or tested, we have to add an extra component, which I call as measured by, or the constraint. So for example, we need our customers to know that we care about them as measured by 95% of customer inquiries must be successfully resolved in the first contact by the end of Q4 of this year. Okay, so underneath you see a little quote and it says you cannot test a request. And I always say that to people because I want you to remember that when your stakeholders give you a very vague piece of information, it's not your fault. It's not, but it is your responsibility to then fill in all the holes. Now, the best stakeholders are going to give you both the capability and the constraint, or in any operating conditions, but sometimes they don't, and that's part of the reason why we get paid. I tell everybody, you know, if doing this job was easy, they wouldn't need us. Our job wouldn't even exist. The IIBA would not exist. If requirements were easy, there'd be no reason for the IIBA. There'd be no reason for business analysts or product owners. The business people could go directly to the tech people and get what they need. And as we know, that's not the case. All right. So what I'm going to do is give you an example, and we're going to be talking about system function requirement, you know, what I call how it's built, or a product orientation. Usually in that kind of world, where you're dealing with product, a lot of times you'll get a system shell command. The system shell, or the system shall allow the user to. And you'll notice that I capitalize the word then, because I want you to think in terms of given, when, and then. So just in your brain, you go, oh, then the system shall, or then the system shall allow the user to. That lets you know that you're dealing with the subordinate clause, or the back end of the statement. So then that begins the process of then trying to figure out what the front side is. But a lot of times we're given a partial back end, and we got to finish out the back end then before we can go hunt down the front end that drives it. All right. So the system shell capability as measured by constraint, we just give you an example of that, or the system shell capability operating within a condition, which is a non-functional as measured by constraint. So the capability is your functional component, and your condition under which it operates can be a non-functional component. So a lot of people believe that there are functional requirements and non-functional requirements, and that's correct, but they can also be part of the same statement, and that's correct as well. So again, there's no wrong way to do it. There's just different ways. Here's kind of a business requirement user story. And I always say how it's used, or a process orientation. So when you're dealing with people in their process, using the system shell doesn't always lend itself to communicating effectively. So user stories are a great way to gather illicit information from your stakeholders. As a actor, job title, stakeholder, I need a capability, some kind of functional requirements, so that benefit, whatever it is that benefits them as measured by constraint. Now you'll notice only 2 of the bullets are colored, right? Because most of a user story is just fluff. It doesn't really lend itself to the test statement. You don't necessarily need to know who the stakeholder, actor, job title is, and you don't necessarily need to know the benefit. You do need the capability, and you do need the constraint. So again, just information. But one of the things that's really useful, and this really comes out for people who do a lot of user stories, is the concept of acceptance criteria, which again, given, when, and then, we just talked about a testable statement as a given, precondition, or an input. When is a trigger or a process or an event. When that occurs, then you have some kind of planned output. That's called acceptance criteria in the user story parlance. But the given, when, and then approach is very useful when you're listening to your stakeholders tell you their needs. So a lot of times I'm, taking notes, and I'm listening, and they're writing down their needs, and then I have to come back and try to elicit what the preconditions are, what the triggers or the process might be that drives that need. Now, in a traditional test format, you take whatever is written, and then you test against the planned output. You test the actual result. You go through that process. And if there's no variance, the test passes and everybody's happy, we hope, and we move forward with a finalized whatever it is that we're building. Okay. But now I'm going to throw a little curveball at you. and just point out that it's not as easy as it seems. So here's a traditional user story on, a little post-it note. Banking application user story, transfer money between accounts, very common way to write it maybe in your backlog. As a bank customer, I need to transfer money between my accounts so that I have money where I need it to be. Great. So I'm going to add the acceptance criteria underneath, and you'll see I have 2 scenarios. Now I could have dozens of scenarios, but I'm only going to pick 2 to just make a point right here. So I go through my user story, and then I have scenario number 1, sufficient funds. So I say, given account A has $125 available and account B has $375 available. This is the front end of the test case. When I transfer 200 from B to A, then, now look at the back end, then I should see a confirmation message, and A should have 325 available and B should have 175 available. So when I go to run the test, I actually walk through that process, I should see a confirmation message that particular scenario has passed. Okay, now let me give you a different scenario where there's insufficient funds. Given A has 125 available and B has 375 available, when I transfer 200 from A to B, which you can't do, then I should see an error message. And A should still have 125 available and B should still have 375 available. But when I actually go to test it, if I see a confirmation message, then that scenario has failed. Guess what? That requirement has failed. Now, this is a mindset, and I'm going to explain something that a lot of times as analysts, we really, a lot of times, only take it to the user story. And in many organizations, some organizations, analysts are testers, but in the ones that I deal with, most analysts only get to the user story, transfer money between accounts. They don't actually go down as deep as the unique scenarios. That's usually handled by a technical group, QA, software, whatever. Now, what the analyst doesn't realize is that every scenario creates a new requirement, technically. So you could have one user story, and based on scenarios, you could have 100 scenarios, which means you now have 100 requirements. And this is why it's so important that you understand how to put it all together, because if you write scenarios or if you write your statements in such a way that they come out incorrect, then you create lots and lots of rework, which then extends the amount of project time, delivery time, and drives everybody crazy, including your stakeholders. Right. So the idea is to recognize that you have power of the pen. That's what I'm always trying to convince my business analysts, is that, you have a lot of power in your pen. Without going off too much on a tangent, I always tell people that business analysts and project managers and scrum masters and product owners design work for other people. And we can design the work to be really efficient and make the process flow smoothly, or we can design the work to be inefficient and it slows everything down. And it's all based on how you write all of your statements and how you write your information. Okay, now, again, the best way to think of this is as a tester. Now, this is the traditional V model of testing, and there's nothing wrong with this model at all, nothing at all. It's traditional. It starts off on the left side where you start at your business requirements level and you decompose or abstract them down to the lowest level. So you got your business requirements ready for use. You got your system requirements, feature, function, use case, user stories. You got your architectural design, service level operations, your unit design, your building components. Then the process of development begins. And as we come back, we start testing, first kind of at a syntax level and then at a nuance level. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. But we come back up and we've got unit testing, which is the mechanics. We've got quality of service testing, which is the environment. We have system testing, which is the product. And then we have acceptance testing, which is the process. We don't really tell you much more than that. We don't tell you what tests fit in those models. And this particular order isn't locked in stone. And that's another thing, is that sometimes we tend to take things literally when really they're just a way for us to kind of get our brain wrapped around what's going to happen. But as you know, if you've worked in this business long enough, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't come out exactly the way it was designed. So including the way we explain things. So I felt like it was really be a useful concept if I took the V model of testing and I put it into what's called the 4 quadrants of testing. So they're the same information, they're just presented in a different way of looking at it. So the way I want you to think about the world from a testing perspective is I want you to think in terms of, first of all, communication. And in the previous session, we talked about nuanced ambiguity, which is natural language. So the business facing side of what we do, the analyst talking to the stakeholder, that's very nuanced. The stakeholders will tell you things thinking that they are very clear until you come back to them for acceptance testing and they go, that's not what I asked for. Okay, so that component of it is very, very difficult. What our job is to help convert nuance into syntax, which is technology facing. So you see the top in the center, it says business facing nuance, and then in the bottom, it says technology facing syntax. On the left-hand side of the screen, it says how it's built, product orientation. And on the right-hand side of the screen, it says how it's used, process orientation. So the idea here is that, and it's not in any particular order, it's just that we had to create these quadrants and they overlap. That's the other thing that we don't really get into but in this session, but I want you to know that they're not mutually exclusive of each other. They overlap many different times throughout your process. But what I'm always trying to get my students to do is think in terms of quadrants when you're listening to your stakeholders. Hey, is that a product syntax type of a test that it's going to need, or is that a product nuance type of a test? So product syntax would be, Q1 integration testing. Product nuance would be system functional, where you got a human sitting in front of a machine. Process syntax, that would be your quality of service, the environment, your non-functional type of requirements, and then process nuance, that would be acceptance testing, where it's very subtle about whether or not the business owner actually accepts what you produced. And their reasons for not accepting it could be very minor, but cause all kinds of domino effects down the way. Hey, we didn't like this or that particular thing. You guys got the requirements wrong. We didn't get it wrong. But it wasn't clarified early on in the process. And so again, the more you can think like a tester, the better it's going to serve you when you go to write both the front and the back end of your statements. All right, that being said, so what do we mean by this? Well, let me just give you some examples of different kinds of tests. There's hundreds and hundreds of tests that you can do, different names of tests. And obviously we can't put them all here. So we just give you some examples, but let's just start down in Q1, which is really an area that's predominantly going to be the development environment. And it's for the most part completely automated today. And it's test-driven development. And in that environment, and many of you probably are working in those kind of environments now, you got your unit tests, your component testing, your integration testing. So when you're eliciting requirements from your stakeholders, I'm always thinking in terms of, okay, that's going to be handled by unit testing. And so the statements need to be written in such a way that it can pass unit testing. This is where I'm going with this. Let's go up to Q2, system testing. This is your user interface testing, where you might have someone sitting in front of a solution after it's been produced, and they're walking through navigation screens. They're doing like the horizontal ribbon, or they're going down vertically on the screen. What they're looking for are errors and omissions. And of course, many analysts aren't trained as testers, which is why we tend to kind of overlook things. For many of us, if it works as designed, then it passes. But that's not really what we need to be able to think about or do. We need to think in terms of, well, what if it doesn't work? So you'll see it says user interface navigation, then it says user interface functional. And the first one is valid data. And that's where most of us are just like, yeah, it works, it passed. But a tester doesn't think like that. Testers are trained to break the system. So they're going to have negative testing. They're going to have invalid data testing. They're going to push the boundaries of the machine. They're going to have what's called condition coverage testing. The more you're aware of this, the more it's going to affect the way you write your statements. And this is a point I'm always trying to get at is you're going to go talk to your business stakeholders. They're going to give you information in a nuanced business format, but at some point it's got to make it all the way through down to syntactical writing for somebody to test. Now you might say to yourself, well, that's not my job. Okay, I'm not disagreeing. It's not necessarily your job, but it's good to be educated about it, because if the statements that you're writing are causing a lot of rewriting, then you're slowing the process down. Okay, now, and I'm about to just shatter everybody's little bubble. Within 10 years, and I'll say this with this 100% confidence because I've been pretty accurate for the last 15. Within 10 years, you'll have an Alexa type of device built in, whether it's your phone or your computer or whatever, that's with you 24/7 that you're talking to about your job. Not just the home Alexa device where Alexa turn the lights off, Alexa turn the lights on, or Cortana or Siri or Bixby or Google Now or whatever your assistant is, but your institutions will be providing you with an interface to intelligence. I mean, that was the first thing that I was trying to teach in the very first webinar, was that intelligence is here. It just isn't fully deployed. It's like 5G. It's here, it's just not everywhere, okay? So if you are really good at writing requirements, then what you're doing is you're enabling intelligence faster. And if you are poor at writing requirements, you're gonna get exposed very quickly. And that's just the thing that I always try to point out to people is because of the nature of how we operate and because of the nature of the learning systems that we have now, when you make errors and omissions, you get exposed very quickly. So that's why understanding how to write test cases is really important to you as a business analyst. Okay. Q3, acceptance testing, is, again, test-driven development, which is a kind of where most organizations, especially those that are going to DevOps, are in that kind of mode. You have specification by example, which is a prototyping mechanism. You have behavior-driven design, which a lot of that's our user stories. You have design-based testing, which is activity coverage. You have decision coverage, this is all from your flow. You have design condition coverage. And then finally you have exploratory testing, which is a little bit of everything just to see what's going on. Your system architects, so your developers and your system architects are basically in the lower syntax arena. Your developers are doing unit integration testing. Your system architects are testing the environment under which everything operates, quality of service. So that you'll have things like performance benchmarks, security benchmarks, stress testing, load testing. There's all kinds of other tests that are run that are environmental. But again, it's important as an analyst, I'm not telling you to become a tester. I'm just telling you to think like a tester. The more you can think like a tester, the better your statements are going to be written. The better your statements are written, the more likely they are to pass. Okay. Again, as I was mentioning, we have passed the threshold of when digital assistants have shown up. I mean, they're here now. They're not everywhere yet. We're kind of in that transition where, and I'm going to use an analogy from the 80s when I started, where people had typewriters on their desks and they had gotten PCs for the very first time. And it took a while to transition away where nobody ever used a typewriter again. I mean, it took quite a few years, but eventually now you go around and you can't see a typewriter almost anywhere. It's like, and my kids don't even know what one is. What's a typewriter? So, but this is where we are right now, is the automation is there. It's available to us. It's just not ubiquitous into everything that we're doing. But many of you are starting to see it or feel it through your personal dashboards. For those of you that have personal dashboards, know that this is the next step. is just really, that's all automation really is it's the data that's driven from all of the sensors, all that telemetry. And what we're doing is we're putting what's called cognitive services on the front of that data, where you can talk to it and it can talk back to you. All right. In your slide deck that I'll be sending out to you, what's great for you is that there's a universal testing method, and it's pretty standard. It's universal. Obviously, different organizations do slightly different things, but generally speaking, you're going to do these 9 steps. You're going to model your test space. You're going to determine your coverage, like how many things you're going to test. You're going to determine your sources of truth, your data, your oracles. You're going to identify your test procedures. That was the 4 quadrants. Configure your test system, operate your test system, observe your results. So it's like science 101. It's all based on observation. You're going to evaluate those results and determine if the test passes or fails. Your stakeholders at user acceptance testing are basically doing the same thing without the formality. They're going to go through their process and they're going to observe the results, and either it passes or it fails. And I'll just tell you right now, it's, even with all that I know, it's still very difficult to get your stakeholders to explain clearly what they want until you produce something. It's the I'll know it when I see it syndrome. And then of course you report your test results. So that's the universal testing method. Okay. In summary, so to wrap it up, I want you to start thinking in terms of, if you can, product syntax, which is the very technical aspects of the product side, product nuance, which is the more business-oriented, subtle interface relationship between the human and the machine, acceptance testing, which is process nuance, which is, could be machine facing, but it might simply be just process away from the machines, and all the subtlety involved in that. And then finally, process syntax. And when you see the world in those quadrants and you start to understand the tests, then it'll help you really begin to elicit requirements in a way that will pass the tests. I always try to tell students, rig the game to win. This is one game that you're allowed to rig to win. It's not unethical to make sure that your requirements pass tests. What is frustrating is when you write things and someone has to convert it and convert it and convert it, and then it doesn't pass. So the closer you can make it to what it's ultimately going to look like, the better it serves everybody in your process. Okay, so now I'll open up the floor to any questions. Any questions, thoughts, issues?
Hey, Rick, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, this is Preston. I had a quick question for you about how this works in particularly dynamic work environments. So thinking maybe like startup culture type of situation. There's oftentimes I've experienced where those who are asking for a project or for a business deliverable don't actually know what they want. Yeah. So when you're getting requirements and the requirements are around something they thought they wanted at the time, and it turns out by the end of the project it's completely different. Right. Like how do you have any advice for working through those scenarios where either they weren't thought of for the test cases, so unthought of test cases, or just generally how to steer the conversation in the right direction to save time down the road? Yeah, so the focus, so it's subtle. You have to be really, really subtle, okay? Because they don't really, if you go back and you say, well, that's not a requirement. Hey, we need to do this. Our requirements are X, Y, and Z. And you go, well, that's not a requirement. Then all you're going to do is create conflict, right? So, and in the beginning, like you say, a lot of times we don't know. Everybody does this. I mean, I'm as guilty of starting a project with a certain set of requirements and then realizing that what I thought was the project wasn't the project. I got all these other projects to do first before I can get to this one. So it's like, I know what the end result I need to get to, but I don't know how to get there. And so that's going to dictate a lot of the changes that happen in the requirements process as you're going through that. Okay. So the only real technique that you can use is you got to try to get people to give you measurable thoughts.
which is not easy to do. And it's the term as measured by. And I always do it in a real subtle way. When someone says, hey, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and I'll say, that's great. As measured by what? And I try to be as nice about it as possible. And they say, well, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, you know, you can't really test. We call those statements just, you know, generic kind of requests, and we want to fulfill your request. But we have a testing process, and we're going to have to get it through the testing process before we can deliver anything back to you. So I always tell everybody there's a testing process, even if there's not. I always tell them that there's a testing process. We want to make sure, just like an inspection process, we want to make sure that it's working right, but we need to know how it's measured. In order to get it through that, we got to know how it's measured. And the focus on measurement forces your stakeholders to rethink how they're communicating to you. That's the biggest takeaway that I can give to you, is that you got to get your stakeholders to think not about just the deliverable, but more importantly, how they're going to measure the deliverable. And it's not easy, because a lot of times people are busy and they don't really want to hear that. And they don't want to hear that they haven't thought about it properly. And so I'm not telling them that there's anything that they've done incorrectly. I'm putting it back on the shoulders of testing, inspection. Hey, we gotta make sure it works. So we got to know how we're measuring it to make sure that it works. Now, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's the only advice I got.
No, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions? All right. Cool. Well, if that's it, then yes. Let me repeat that. Yeah, if you get a chance, please join the Tampa Bay IIBA. Click on Cliff's link right there. We have a great organization. It's really been phenomenal, especially now with COVID, that we've got, you know, because everybody's gotten used to the Zoom and the virtual environment. So please join our group on LinkedIn. And this is session number 3. I got 5 more going. So next week I'm going to do structured language. Anybody that's been in the last 3, I apologize. We repeated them because we wanted to get them into this new thing. So I got 5 more. The next one's on natural language processing. So we're going to be on natural language processing, and then there's a whole a group of them. So next week and the week after and the week after are all new content. So it won't be a repeat anymore of the last 3. So, but you'll get an invite, you'll get the slide deck and everything else. So great, thank you. Hopefully it was useful. Hopefully you got a takeaway that you can put to use right away. So that's the goal. Yes, I'm working on the recordings at last week and this week. So thank you for asking. Yes, you will get the slides. Oh, to get the slides, please send an email to rfrederick.pmp. I'm going to give you my Gmail account, Gmail. Okay, please send an email to rfrederick.pmp@gmail.com, and I will send you this back to slide deck. Because I don't have your email from here, so I can't really just send it. I try not to just post it. I would like people to. So if you can see, there's my email at the top in the white, rfrederick.pmp@gmail.com. So, all right, excellent. Thank you all for attending, and we'll just call it there. We'll see you guys next week.